My name is Hailey. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, people have described me the same way: steady, reasonable, dependable. The kind of woman you can count on, the kind of woman who won't make a scene. I work in operations for a consulting firm here in Seattle. On paper, that means I solve problems before anyone else notices they exist. In practice, it means I sit in rooms where louder voices decide things, and I make sure those decisions don't collapse under their own weight. Most people assume I'm agreeable because I'm calm. They confuse composure with compliance. They think that because I don't raise my voice, I don't keep score. What they didn't know, what he didn't know, is that silence is not the same thing as surrender. This story isn't dramatic in the way you might expect. There were no slammed doors, no screaming matches that rattled the neighbors' windows. In fact, that's almost the point. We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. 38 separate conversations, 38 attempts at clarity, and every single one ended the same way. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. From the outside, we looked functional, successful even. Two adults navigating stress, work, and ambition. But beneath that surface was a pattern so subtle it took me years to name it. I would bring something up, calmly, thoughtfully. He would deflect, minimize, and reframe. I would try again later, softer, clearer, more precise. And eventually, I would stop talking. Not because I agreed, because I was learning. This isn't a revenge story. I didn't burn his life down. I didn't expose secrets or orchestrate some theatrical collapse. What I did was much quieter than that. I paid attention. And when the time came, I made a decision that didn't require shouting to be irreversible. If you've ever been the reasonable one, the one who smooths things over, the one who tells herself, maybe it's not worth the fight, then you might recognize parts of this journey. Have you ever stayed quiet so long that people forgot you had a voice at all? To them, I was the stabilizer. At work, I was the woman who kept everything running. The compliment was always delivered with a smile, as if invisibility were an award. In meetings, my job wasn't to originate the bold ideas. It was to make sure the bold ideas didn't implode. If a client contract had inconsistencies, I caught them. If projections were overly optimistic, I quietly adjusted the spreadsheet before anyone else noticed. No one ever said I wasn't intelligent. They just rarely needed to acknowledge it out loud. At home, the dynamic was eerily similar. Ethan liked to describe me as low maintenance. He said it like praise. "You're just easy, Hailey," he'd tell friends. "You don't overreact to things." What he meant was, I didn't demand. When plans changed last minute, I adapted. When he forgot something important, I covered for it. When conversations veered toward uncomfortable territory, I chose calm phrasing over confrontation. I believed that maturity meant de-escalation. And for a long time, I wore that identity proudly. The reasonable one, the grounded one, the emotionally intelligent one. But being the emotionally intelligent one in a room full of people who rely on that trait can slowly turn into something else. You become the shock absorber. Every impact lands on you because you're the only one built to take it. In our relationship, I was the translator. If he snapped at me after a bad day, I translated it into stress. If he dismissed something I said, I translated it into distraction. If he avoided a difficult conversation, I translated it into exhaustion. I always found a way to explain him back into innocence. Our friends saw us as balanced. He was charismatic, ambitious, and a little impulsive. I was steady, thoughtful, measured. People would laugh and say, Hailey keeps him in line. I used to smile when they said that, because the truth was, I wasn't keeping anyone in line. I was keeping myself small enough not to disrupt the image. There's a subtle difference between being calm and being conditioned. I didn't notice it at first. It felt natural to let him lead certain conversations, natural to step back when he grew animated, natural to choose timing carefully before bringing up something sensitive. I told myself this was a partnership, but over time, I realized something uncomfortable. I was curating my tone more than my truth. Before I spoke, I would mentally rehearse how to say it in a way that wouldn't trigger defensiveness. I would soften the edges of my sentences, replace I need with maybe we could, replace this bothers me with I might be overthinking, but I became fluent in dilution. And because I delivered everything so calmly, so reasonably, it created an illusion that nothing was truly urgent, that nothing was deeply wrong, even when it was. The irony is that I wasn't weak. I managed multi-million dollar operational systems at work. I negotiated vendor contracts. I handled conflict resolution between executives twice my age. But in the intimate space of my own relationship, I defaulted to accommodation. Not because I was incapable of confrontation, because I believed love should feel peaceful, and peace in my mind meant lowering the volume of my own discomfort. So to them, my colleagues, my friends, Ethan, I was composed, balanced, mature, safe. What no one realized was that safety, when unreciprocated, slowly becomes isolation. I was present in every room, but I was not fully seen in any of them. And the most dangerous part? I helped build that version of myself. The first time it happened, it was almost forgettable. That's why it stayed with me. We were sitting at the kitchen counter on a Tuesday night. I remember because Tuesdays were my longest days at work. Back to back operational reviews, no real lunch break. I had come home tired but clear headed. I had rehearsed the conversation in my mind during traffic. I wanted to talk about finances, not because we were in crisis, because we weren't aligned. Ethan had made another significant investment without telling me first. It wasn't reckless exactly, but it wasn't discussed either. And we shared more than an apartment. We shared long-term plans. At least, I thought we did. I approached it carefully. I just wish we talked about bigger financial decisions beforehand, I said. Calm tone, open posture, no accusation. He didn't look up from his phone at first. It's not that big, he replied. You're overthinking it. That sentence landed softly, but it landed. I remember the specific sensation. Not anger, not even hurt. Just a quiet internal pause. Like something inside me had taken a small step back to observe. I'm not overthinking, I said gently. I just want us to be aligned. He sighed. The kind of sigh meant to signal inconvenience. Hailey, it's handled. Why create tension where there isn't any? There it was. The reframing. The issue wasn't the decision. The issue was my discomfort with it. I could feel the crossroads in that moment. Push further and risk being labeled dramatic, or de escalate and preserve the evening. So I softened. I'm not trying to create tension, I said. I just think communication matters. He nodded, distracted now, already half out of the conversation. Sure, next time. Next time, two words that felt like closure, but weren't. We didn't circle back. There was no follow up discussion, No shared spreadsheet, no plan. The subject dissolved. But I didn't. I replayed that exchange later while brushing my teeth. Not obsessively, just analytically. I noticed how quickly my concern had been minimized, how smoothly the focus shifted from the action to my reaction. And what unsettled me most wasn't his response. It was mine. I had accepted it. I told myself it was small, not worth pushing. Relationships require flexibility. No one gets everything perfectly right. But something subtle had shifted, because for the first time, I saw the pattern forming. I would bring something forward. He would reduce it. I would recalibrate. The world didn't shake. There was no dramatic fallout. We still went to bed at the same time, still planning a weekend hike, still texted each other good morning. From the outside, nothing had changed, but internally, I had logged it, not emotionally, systematically. It was the first small cut, barely visible, easy to dismiss. But I knew enough about systems, about structures under stress, to understand this. It's never the single fracture that causes collapse. It's the repeated pressure on the same point. And something told me, even then, that this wouldn't be the last time. After the first time, I told myself it was situational. Stress, timing, miscommunication. After the fifth time, I told myself relationships require patience. After the 12th, I stopped counting out of frustration and started counting out of clarity. The arguments were never explosive. That's what made them so difficult to name. I would bring up something specific: finances, long term planning, shared responsibilities, and even tone during disagreements. I was precise, measured. I avoided absolutes. I avoided blame. And almost every time, the response followed a pattern. You're reading too much into it. That's not what I meant. Why does everything have to be a discussion? It was never loud enough to be called abuse, never cruel enough to justify outrage, just consistent enough to erode something invisible. What unsettled me most wasn't that he disagreed with me, it was that my perspective rarely survived the conversation intact. By the end of each exchange, I would find myself slightly disoriented. Not because he yelled, but because the original issue had quietly shifted shape. Somehow, we'd end up dissecting my delivery instead of his decision. Your tone feels critical. You always bring this up at the worst times. You're making it bigger than it is. And because I valued fairness, I would pause. Was my timing off? Was I being overly analytical? Was I expecting too much alignment? I prided myself on self reflection. It was one of my strengths. But self reflection, when overused, turns inward too sharply. I began editing myself before conversations even started. If I had a concern, I would wait for the perfect moment, the right mood, the right level of calm. I would draft sentences in my head like internal emails, refining language to eliminate any possible misinterpretation. And still, the outcome rarely changed. We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. That silence became our normal, not cold, not hostile, just suspended. We would pause the conversation for later. Later would come and go. Days would pass. We would resume routines, cook dinner, watch shows, attend events. And because nothing visibly exploded, I told myself we were functional. But there's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from unresolved loops. It's the mental load of carrying on conversations that never conclude. I started noticing something else too. In group settings, Ethan was decisive, confident, animated. He debated ideas with ease. He respected pushback from colleagues, from friends. But in private, when I pushed back, It was framed as friction. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he feels safest enough with me to resist. Maybe intimacy makes feedback feel heavier. Maybe I'm the one expecting too much emotional symmetry. That's how normalization works. You don't wake up one day and accept disrespect. You adapt to it in increments. You contextualize it. You intellectualize it. You minimize it. And because there's no dramatic event to anchor your discomfort, you start doubting whether it qualifies as discomfort at all. But my body kept score. Even when my mind excused it, I noticed the tightness in my chest before bringing up certain topics, the slight hesitation before expressing a need, the subtle relief when I decided not to bring something up at all. Peace became synonymous with silence, and silence began to feel safer than clarity. The most dangerous shift wasn't his dismissal, it was my growing willingness to live around it. There's a moment when you realize you've been cast in a role you never consciously auditioned for. For me, it wasn't during an argument. It was at a dinner party. We were at a friend's apartment. 6 of us around a long wooden table, candles burning low, wine glasses half full. The conversation drifted toward relationships, as it always does when people feel safe enough to compare notes. Someone joked about how every couple has a manager. Without hesitation, Ethan smiled and gestured toward me. "That's Hailey," he said. "She handles the details. I just execute." Everyone laughed. I smiled too. On the surface, it sounded flattering, competent, trusted. But something about the phrasing caught in my mind. She handles the details. Details, not decisions, not direction, not vision. Details. Later that night, as we drove home through the quiet Seattle streets, I replayed the comment. Not because it was insulting, but because it was revealing. In his version of us, I was infrastructure, necessary but not central, reliable but not leading. At work, I was used to that positioning. Operations exist behind the scenes. When everything runs smoothly, no one notices you. When something breaks, everyone does. But in a partnership, invisibility feels different. I started noticing how often I defaulted to support mode. If we traveled, I researched logistics. If we hosted, I planned menus. If something needed follow through, I remembered. I wasn't forced into these tasks. I stepped into them efficiently, quietly, and over time, that quiet efficiency hardened into expectation. When I once suggested we switch roles for a weekend trip, just as an experiment, Ethan laughed lightly. "You'd hate not being in control," he said. Control? Another subtle mislabeling. The organization wasn't in control. It was a responsibility. And I carried it because if I didn't, things fell through. The realization came slowly. I wasn't just perceived as steady. I was depended on to absorb uncertainty, to smooth tension, to anticipate gaps, to stay calm when conversations grew uncomfortable. And the more composed I remained, the more permanent that assignment became. There's a quiet trap in being the capable one. People assume you don't need not as much reassurance, not as many accommodations, not as many repairs. You become the emotional adult in every room. And adults, in people's minds, don't get to be fragile. The hardest part wasn't that Ethan expected steadiness from me. It was what I had trained him to. Every time I de-escalated instead of insisting. Every time I absorbed instead of addressing. Every time I told myself, it's fine, I reinforced the role: reliable, useful, invisible. And invisibility, when consistent, becomes identity. But something inside me was beginning to resist that identity. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to recognize that being assigned a role is different from choosing one. And I had never consciously chosen this. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. Ethan was out for a run. The apartment was still, soft gray light filtering through the windows. I was at the kitchen table with my black leather notebook open in front of me, a habit I'd had since my early 20s. Whenever something felt unclear, I wrote, not emotionally, structurally. That morning, I wasn't planning to journal about us. I meant to outline quarterly budget adjustments, but instead, without fully deciding to, I wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. What would change if I stopped trying to be understood? I stared at it for a long time. For years, my strategy had been refined. If I could just explain myself more clearly, if I chose the right timing, if I removed any emotional charge from my tone, then eventually the issue would land. But what if clarity wasn't the problem? What if the conversation wasn't failing? Because I wasn't articulate enough, but because he wasn't invested enough to engage. That thought didn't make me angry. It made me calm. There's a specific kind of calm that comes when you stop negotiating with reality. I flipped back through older pages in my notebook. Notes from past months, fragments of conversations, dates. I hadn't intended to document patterns, but I had. Concerns about finances, concerns about shared planning, concerns about dismissiveness. Repeated, rephrased, revisited. We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. Seeing it written down stripped it of ambiguity. It wasn't emotional exaggeration, it was data. And then I wrote something else. If nothing changes, can I live like this in 5 years? The answer came quickly. No. Not because it was unbearable, because it was unsustainable. There's a difference. Unbearable forces you to react. Unsustainable invites you to plan. That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly, not in my tone, not in my behavior that day. Internally, I stopped viewing our conversations as attempts to repair and started viewing them as information. That distinction changed everything. When he came home later and mentioned another upcoming financial move, again, without prior discussion, I felt the familiar opening for a conversation. Normally, I would have taken it. Instead, I simply said, okay. He glanced at me, maybe expecting a follow-up. There was none. Not passive-aggressive, not icy, just neutral. He continued talking, unaware that something fundamental had recalibrated. For the first time, I wasn't trying to convince him of my perspective. I was observing, collecting, assessing. It wasn't withdrawal, it was an evaluation. And in that evaluation, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Stability. Because once you accept that someone is showing you exactly how they engage with your needs, you stop exhausting yourself trying to redraw the blueprint. You begin designing your own. That Sunday morning didn't end in confrontation. It ended in clarity. And clarity, when quiet, can look exactly like compliance. But it's not. It's preparation. After that Sunday, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been a reflex, an attempt to keep the peace, a soft retreat when conversations looped without landing. It carried disappointment, even if I didn't show it. Now, it carried intention. The next time a familiar issue surfaced, I felt the old script rise in my throat. The careful phrasing, the calibrated tone, the desire to make him understand. And then I let it pass. Not because it didn't matter, because I was no longer trying to solve it through dialogue. Ethan didn't notice at first. Why would he? From his perspective, the friction had decreased. The overthinking had stopped. The discussions that once stretched late into the evening no longer interrupted dinner. You seem lighter lately, he said one night. I nodded. I've just been focusing on my own priorities. That was true. What he heard was, the issue is resolved. What I meant was, I've stopped expecting you to resolve it with me. There's a misconception about silence, that it's weakness. The quieter person in a conflict is the one conceding. But silence can also be containment. I began reallocating energy. Instead of preparing arguments, I prepared plans. Instead of rehearsing conversations, I reviewed numbers. Instead of explaining my needs again, I evaluated what would happen if they continued unmet. At work, nothing changed. If anything, I was sharper, more decisive. I noticed how naturally I set boundaries with vendors, how easily I clarified expectations with colleagues. Here's the scope. That won't work. We'll need written confirmation. Clear, direct, unapologetic. It struck me one afternoon how effortless that clarity felt in professional settings and how negotiated it had felt at home. The contrast was illuminating. Ethan mistook my quiet for contentment. He started making comments about how stable things felt, how mature we were compared to other couples who fought all the time. We didn't fight loudly anymore. We just didn't resolve anything either. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. But now, the silence wasn't a wound, it was space. And in that space, I was thinking differently. I stopped volunteering emotional labor. If he forgot something, I didn't compensate automatically. If plans were unclear, I didn't chase clarity on his behalf. I observed what happened when I removed my stabilizing influence. Small gaps appeared, deadlines slightly missed, details overlooked, minor inconveniences that I would have once preempted. He noticed the friction, but not the cause. You've been distracted lately, he said once, half joking. I've just been trusting you to handle things, I replied evenly. That unsettled him more than an argument would have. Because arguments give you something to push against. Silence gives you nothing. And in that, nothing, people are forced to face the structure they've been leaning on. I wasn't punishing him. I was recalibrating myself. The most powerful shift wasn't external action. It was this. I no longer needed him to agree with me in order to validate my perspective. That independence of validation is subtle, but once you have it, you stop negotiating for acknowledgement. You start designing for the outcome. And I was getting very clear about what outcome I could live with. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. From the outside, nothing about me changed. I still woke up at 6:15, still made coffee the same way, measured, deliberate. Still carried my black notebook in my bag. Still showed up to dinners, work events, and family gatherings with the same calm expression. What they didn't notice was where my attention had shifted. I started with information, not secrets, not surveillance, just clarity. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor, framed casually as long-term planning. Ethan was too busy to join, which wasn't unusual. I didn't push. I went alone. I asked questions I should have asked earlier. Asset distribution, liability exposure, shared versus individual accounts, legal implications of cohabitation in our state, risk tolerance scenarios. The advisor walked me through the numbers methodically. There was no drama in it, just spreadsheets and projections. But for the first time, I saw our structure not as a relationship, but as a system. And systems, unlike emotions, are measurable. I began separating what was joint from what was personal. Not abruptly, not suspiciously, just responsibly. Redirecting bonuses into accounts in my name, reviewing subscription charges, clarifying whose name was attached to which investment. At home, I started documenting patterns more precisely. Not arguments, patterns. Date, topic, outcome. We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. Seeing the number in ink removed any temptation to romanticize it as normal couple conflict. 38 repetitions isn't miscommunication, it's resistance. Meanwhile, I invested in something else quietly: competence outside of us. I enrolled in a short executive certification program I'd postponed for years. It required late evenings of study. Ethan assumed it was a professional ambition. It was, but it was also insulation. The more autonomous I became professionally, the less psychologically dependent I felt relationally. I updated my resume, not because I planned to leave my job, but because I wanted it current. I reached out to former colleagues for coffee, rebuilt dormant connections, strengthened my network. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. Preparation is most effective when it doesn't announce itself. There's a misconception that power is loud, that leverage requires confrontation. It doesn't. Leverage is simply optionality. And I was building options. At home, Ethan continued as usual. If he sensed distance, he interpreted it as maturity, growth, stability. We've really figured things out, he said one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner. I looked at him carefully. Figured what out? The issues hadn't been resolved. They just stopped being debated. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. But now, the silence was asymmetrical. He rested in it. I worked within it. I also began observing something else: how often he relied on my invisible labor, not maliciously, just habitually. He assumed I'd remind him of deadlines, assume I'd reconcile shared expenses, assume I'd smooth over miscommunications with friends. So I experimented. I stopped preempting, not in ways that would sabotage, just in ways that revealed. If he forgot to RSVP, I didn't fix it. If a payment was late, that was clearly his responsibility. I didn't quietly cover it. The first few times, he seemed mildly surprised. "Oh, I thought you handled that." I didn't realize that was mine. I would respond simply, "I assumed you had it." No accusation, no edge, just a mirror. And slowly, something became clear to me. Our dynamic had been built not only on his dismissiveness, but on my overfunctioning. I had been compensating for the very gaps that frustrated me. Once I stopped compensating, the gaps became visible. To him, they were inconveniences. To me, they were confirmation. The most important preparation wasn't financial, it was emotional. I began detaching outcome from approval. If he never acknowledged the pattern, could I still act? If he never apologized in the way I once hoped, could I still choose differently? Those questions mattered more than any spreadsheet. Because quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about alignment with yourself. And for the first time, my actions and my internal truth were no longer negotiating with each other. They were coordinating. He didn't notice the shift. That was his first mistake. The revelation didn't come from discovering something scandalous. There was no hidden account, no secret betrayal, no dramatic uncovering of deception. It came from reading a clause. I was reviewing documents one evening. Routine, methodical, the kind of administrative task most people postpone. We had signed a cohabitation agreement years earlier, drafted quickly when we first moved in together. At the time, it felt mature, responsible. I hadn't looked at it closely since. This time, I did, line by line. Halfway through, I noticed something I'd glossed over years before. The property allocation structure heavily favored the individual whose name was primary on the lease and investment portfolio. That individual was me. At the time we signed it, Ethan had insisted it didn't matter whose name went where. It's ours, he'd said casually. I had agreed. I believed that shared intention outweighed paperwork. But legally, intention is irrelevant. Documentation is not. I read the clause again, then again. In the event of separation, the primary holder retained controlling interest over specific assets, including the condo investment we'd made 2 years prior, an investment he had emotionally championed, an investment I had financially structured. For a long moment, I just sat there, not triumphant, not vengeful, clear. The leverage wasn't explosive. It wasn't something I could weaponize dramatically. But it shifted the power dynamic in a way he had never accounted for. He assumed we were symmetrically exposed. We weren't. And the irony was almost quiet enough to be poetic. For years, he had minimized my concerns about financial transparency, framed them as overanalysis, suggested I was creating tension where none existed. Meanwhile, my overanalysis had created structural security. I didn't confront him with this information. That wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time, I understood the full landscape of our shared life without needing his validation to interpret it. We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. But now, I realized something critical. Resolution doesn't always come from agreement. Sometimes it comes from acceptance. Acceptance that someone has shown you their engagement threshold. Acceptance that patterns are data. Acceptance that protection is not aggression. I closed the document and reached for my notebook. Under that day's date, I wrote, I am not trapped. That sentence did something subtle but profound inside me. Until that moment, part of my hesitation to act differently had been rooted in fear, not of him, but of destabilizing everything we had built. Shared routines, shared investments, shared social circles. But the structure was sturdier for me than I had realized. Not because I had planned it as an escape route, because I had always been meticulous. My steadiness, once framed as overthinking, was now insulation. The revelation wasn't about winning. It was about optionality. For the first time, I wasn't evaluating whether he would change. I was evaluating whether I needed him to. That shift is quiet, but irreversible. Later that night, he mentioned a new opportunity he was considering. Another decision, again presented after the fact. His tone carried that familiar confidence, the expectation that I would either support or gently question. I listened, and for the first time, I didn't feel urgency, not to correct, not to persuade, not to soften, just clarity. Because when you know the ground beneath you is solid, you stop negotiating for space on someone else's. The private reveal didn't create drama, it removed doubt. And once doubt is removed, decisions become simpler, not easier, but cleaner. Clarity doesn't shout, it settles. For weeks after reading that clause, I didn't act immediately. I watched myself instead, observed my own reactions in real time, tested whether the calm I felt was temporary, an emotional spike from discovering leverage, or something steadier. It was steady. The final decision didn't happen during the conflict. In fact, it happened on a night that felt almost pleasant. We were sitting on the couch, a documentary playing in the background. Ethan was half focused on his phone, half commenting on what we were watching. I had brought up something small earlier that week. Another instance of financial autonomy without discussion. We had talked about it, which meant I expressed concern. He reframed it. I clarified. He minimized. We paused. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. That night, I realized something precise. It wasn't that he couldn't understand me. It was that he didn't experience enough consequence not to. There had been no structural reason for him to adjust. My discomfort had never translated into impact. I absorbed it, smoothed it, rationalized it. So why would the pattern change? I excused myself quietly and went into the bedroom. Not to cry, not to dramatize, just to think. There were realistically three paths forward. Option 1: escalate, demand counseling, issue ultimatums, force the issue into visibility. Option 2: accept the dynamic fully, stop bringing concerns up at all, redefine my expectations downward, and stay. Option 3: make a decision independent of his participation. The first option required his willingness. The second required my diminishment. The third required only clarity. I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel the weight of that third option. Leaving wasn't theatrical. It wouldn't shock anyone dramatically. There had been no public implosion, no betrayal narrative. From the outside, we were stable. But internally, I had been negotiating for mutuality for years. We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. 38 attempts at alignment. At some point, repetition stops being hope. It becomes evidence. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. That's important. Anger can burn hot and then cool. This was different. It was the quiet acknowledgement that love without responsiveness slowly erodes respect. Not just for the other person, but for yourself. I didn't want to become someone who normalized being unheard. That realization mattered more than comfort. When I walked back into the living room, Ethan glanced up. "You okay?" he asked casually. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to solve us. I was choosing myself. The decision I made that week was not loud. It was administrative. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney, not to threaten, not to intimidate, just to understand my options fully. Once you gather information without emotional charge, the irreversible path often becomes obvious. And I chose it, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I no longer wanted to negotiate my own clarity. Some decisions are dramatic. This one was deliberate. And once made, it did not require his agreement to move forward. The consultation lasted 90 minutes. 90 minutes of measured language, procedural explanations, and neutral facial expressions. The attorney didn't ask about love. He asked about assets, timelines, documentation. I answered calmly, yes. We had a cohabitation agreement. Yes, my name was primarily on the condo investment. Yes, separate accounts existed alongside joint expenses. He nodded as he reviewed the paperwork. "There's nothing contentious here," he said. "If you choose to separate, it can be straightforward." Straightforward. That word felt almost surreal. For years, I had imagined that leaving, if it ever came to that, would be explosive, complicated, emotionally catastrophic. Instead, it looked like signatures, transfers, notice periods. I didn't initiate anything that day. I gathered information. Then I began aligning logistics quietly. I redirected my direct deposit entirely into my personal account. I reviewed our shared auto payments and mapped out which ones would need to be separated. I secured copies of every relevant document: investment statements, lease agreements, and insurance policies. Not out of paranoia, out of preparedness. At home, nothing appeared different. We still cooked dinner together some nights, still discussing weekend plans, still existed within the rhythm we had built. He seemed relaxed, almost proud of how smooth things felt lately. "You've really stopped sweating the small stuff," he said once, half smiling. I returned the smile lightly. I hadn't stopped sweating the small stuff. I had stopped expecting it to change. The next time a familiar topic surfaced, Another financial decision presented post fact. I didn't argue. I didn't even question. I simply asked, have you thought through how that would affect our joint obligations? He paused, briefly, then shrugged. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. For the first time, I heard that phrase without urgency. Whether it would be fine for us was no longer the central question. The central question was whether it would be fine for me. And I had already begun ensuring that it would be. I opened a separate savings account, earmarked specifically for transition expenses. I adjusted my budget projections to reflect single income living. I researched apartment listings, not urgently, just to understand the market. I didn't pack a bag. I built a runway. The most powerful actions were the quietest ones: updating beneficiaries, changing passwords, digitizing records. No dramatic conversations, no emotional scenes. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. But now, the silence worked in my favor. He mistook the absence of debate for harmony. He didn't see that harmony requires participation from both sides. What we had was quiet divergence. There's something almost clinical about moving in silence. It removes the temptation to dramatize your own pain, forces you to deal with facts rather than fantasies. I wasn't waiting for a final argument to justify my decision. I didn't need one. The decision had already been made internally. Everything else was alignment. And alignment, once set in motion, doesn't require noise. It requires follow through. He still believed we were stable. That belief gave me time. Time to move carefully. Time to move cleanly. Time to move without asking permission. The first consequence didn't look like a loss. It looked like an inconvenience. I stopped managing what wasn't explicitly mine. When the quarterly property tax notice arrived, I placed it on the counter without commentary. In the past, I would have scheduled the payment immediately and transferred his portion later. This time, I left it untouched. 2 days passed. On the third, he picked it up. Did you see this? He asked. I did, I replied calmly. I assumed you were handling it. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Not anger, just recalibration. Oh, I thought you usually. I've been trying to be more balanced about shared responsibilities, I said evenly. Balanced. The word sat between us. He paid it that evening, slightly late, with a small penalty fee. Not catastrophic, just noticeable. Small gaps began appearing more frequently. A subscription service lapsed because I hadn't renewed it automatically. A dinner reservation was forgotten because I hadn't confirmed it. A travel itinerary had a minor booking error because I hadn't double-checked it. None of these was sabotage. They were absent. Absence of the invisible labor that had once stabilized everything. At first, he reacted with mild irritation at the situations, not at me. Why is this happening all at once? He muttered one night while sorting through an email thread about a missed deadline. I watched him carefully. It's not all at once, I said. It's just not being preempted. He didn't fully understand what I meant, but he felt it. There's a specific discomfort that comes when someone quietly withdraws structural support. You don't notice it immediately. You just sense that things require more effort than before. That was the beginning. At the same time, I began shifting the larger pieces. I informed him calmly that I would be restructuring our shared account to reflect proportional contributions only, not automatic smoothing from my side. I think it's healthier if we're both directly responsible for our portions, I said. He frowned slightly. Are we having money issues? No, I replied. We're having clarity. He didn't argue, but something unsettled him. For years, my steadiness had absorbed friction before it surfaced. Now, friction was surfacing naturally. We argued about the same issue 38 times, and never solved it once. But lately, the arguments were shorter because I wasn't trying to solve them anymore. When he minimized a concern, I didn't counter. I didn't explain further. I let the statement exist and let its implications unfold later in practical terms. The emotional intensity decreased. The practical consequences increased. He began asking more questions. Are you upset about something? Not upset, I answered truthfully. Just adjusting. Adjusting. That word lingered. I could see the subtle anxiety forming. Not because I had yelled or threatened, but because the familiar dynamic was dissolving. He had relied on my predictability, on my willingness to close loops. Now loops remained open, and open loops create tension. The consequences weren't dramatic, they were cumulative. He felt the loss of efficiency before he understood the loss of certainty. And certainty, once gone, is difficult to restore. He still didn't know about the attorney. He didn't know about the transition fund. He only knew that something stable had shifted. And for the first time, he didn't control the timing of that shift. The panic didn't arrive as an explosion. It arrived as an urgency. One evening, after a minor but telling disagreement about another unilateral financial move, Ethan didn't let the silence settle the way he usually did. Instead, he followed me into the kitchen. Okay, he said, more serious than usual. What's going on? I was rinsing a glass. I turned off the water before answering. What do you mean? You've been different, he said. Less engaged, less reactive. It's like you're not even fighting back anymore. Fighting back. That was his language. I wasn't aware we were in a fight, I replied calmly. He exhaled sharply. You know what I mean. I did. He meant that I had stopped participating in the familiar loop. The loop where I expressed concern. He dismissed it, I clarified. He minimized, and eventually I softened. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. But now, the silence wasn't mutual confusion. It was closure, on my side. I've brought up the same concerns for years, I said, not raising my voice. We've discussed them repeatedly. He ran a hand through his hair. So what? Every couple revisits things. Revisiting implies progress, I answered gently. We revisit without change. He looked at me as if seeing something unfamiliar. How many times are you going to keep score? He asked, half defensive. I stopped keeping score, I said. I started noticing patterns. There it was. The first flicker of real alarm in his expression. Patterns are harder to argue with than feelings. Why didn't you just say something if it was this serious? He asked. I almost smiled, not out of mockery, but disbelief. I did, I said quietly. 38 times. He blinked. What? We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. The number hung in the air like something tangible. That's dramatic, he said reflexively. It's documented, I replied. Silence. Not the usual dismissive silence, a searching one. For the first time, I saw him recalculating, trying to trace back conversations he had long categorized as minor disagreements, trying to reinterpret my previous calm as something other than an overreaction. Why are you bringing this up now? He asked. Because I'm done bringing it up, I said. That was when the panic surfaced. Not loud, but visible. So what does that mean? He pressed. Are you saying you're unhappy? That you want to… what? Break up? The word felt foreign in his mouth, as if the possibility had never been structurally real. I'm saying, I answered carefully, that I've reached the point where repeating myself feels dishonest. To whom? To me. That landed. He stepped back slightly, absorbing it. I can change, he said quickly. If that's what this is about, I can change. We can do counseling. We can restructure things. Just don't make decisions without me. The irony almost made me laugh. For years, decisions had been made without me. Now the absence of consultation felt threatening. It's not about punishment, I said evenly. It's about alignment. Alignment takes work, he argued. I've been doing the work, I replied softly. Alone. That was the moment he understood. Not fully, but enough. This wasn't another loop. This wasn't another debate to outlast. This was a shift that had already occurred. And the most destabilizing realization for him wasn't that I was upset. It was that I was certain. Certainty doesn't raise its voice. It closes doors quietly. And by the time someone hears the click, the lock is already set. The final conversation happened on a Wednesday evening. There was no dramatic setup, no packed suitcase by the door, no trembling hands. Just two adults sitting across from each other at the same kitchen table, where so many circular conversations had unfolded before. Ethan looked tired, not angry, unsettled. I've been thinking about what you said, he began. About the 38 times. I nodded. I didn't realize it felt that repetitive to you. I know, I replied. That was the truth. He hadn't realized. Not because he was incapable of empathy, but because the consequences had never required his awareness. I don't want to lose this, he said. We can fix it. The word fix used to ignite hope in me. It used to signal potential repair possibility. Now it sounded reactive. What does fix look like to you? I asked calmly. More communication, scheduled check-ins, financial planning sessions together, therapy if you want. He spoke quickly, assembling solutions like a man patching visible leaks. These are all things I suggested before, I said gently. He swallowed. I didn't think it was that urgent. That's the difference, I replied. It was urgent to me. Silence, not hostile, just heavy with recognition. For years, I had adjusted my urgency to match his, softened my needs to avoid pressure, minimized my frustration to maintain peace. Now I wasn't adjusting. I met with an attorney, I said evenly. The words didn't shake. They didn't accuse. They simply existed. His face drained of color. Not dramatically, but noticeably. You what? I wanted to understand my options, I clarified. I didn't want to threaten you. I needed clarity for myself. When? He asked quietly. A few weeks ago. He leaned back, absorbing that timeline. The fact that decisions had been unfolding without his input. Why wouldn't you tell me? He asked. Because every time I brought something serious to you, it was reframed, I said. I needed one thing that wasn't up for debate. That hurt him. I could see it. Not because I had yelled, not because I had insulted him, because I had acted independently. You've already decided, he said finally. Yes, the room felt still. Is there anything I can say? He asked. I considered the question honestly. If I believed change would be sustained without me enforcing it, maybe, I said. But I don't want to manage our dynamic anymore. He nodded slowly. The realization is settling in stages. This wasn't an ultimatum. It was a conclusion. We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. This time, the silence was different. It wasn't avoidance. It was acceptance. I didn't think you'd ever leave, he admitted quietly. I know, I said. That was never said with cruelty, just clarity. Because the calmest person in the room is often the one who has already finished deciding. And when a decision is made without heat, it's rarely reversible. It's been a year, long enough for the logistics to settle, for the condo to be refinanced solely in my name, for shared accounts to be closed cleanly, for routines to dissolve and reform into something quieter, simpler. I moved into a smaller place across the city, not as an escape, but as a reset. Fewer rooms, fewer symbolic attachments, more intentional space. The first few months weren't dramatic. There were no breakdowns on the kitchen floor, No late night calls begging for reconsideration. There was just an adjustment. I noticed how much lighter my internal dialogue felt. How rarely I rehearsed conversations in my head now. I no longer edit my tone before speaking. The absence of tension is subtle when it arrives gradually. It's like background noise turning off. At work, something shifted too. I began speaking with the same clarity I'd always had internally, but without softening it unnecessarily. In meetings, when someone dismissed a concern too quickly, I didn't rephrase it for their comfort. I'd like that addressed directly, I would say evenly. No apology, no extra cushioning, and interestingly, no backlash. Competence, when paired with calm certainty, rarely invites resistance. I think about that often. For years, I believed maintaining harmony required me to dilute urgency, that expressing dissatisfaction risked instability, that endurance equaled strength. But endurance without reciprocity becomes erosion. What I've learned isn't about leaving, it's about alignment. I didn't leave because I hated him. I left because I recognized myself disappearing in increments too small to dramatize, but too consistent to ignore. We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. That number doesn't make me angry anymore. It makes me aware of how easily patterns become normalized, of how quietly resentment can be replaced by resignation, of how silence can either be a surrender or a strategy. The difference is intention. Today, my silence is intentional. If something matters, I say it once, clearly. If it's dismissed, I observe. If it repeats, I decide. I don't escalate. I don't chase. I don't negotiate my own clarity. There's a steadiness in that. Friends sometimes ask if I regret not fighting harder, if I regret not issuing ultimatums sooner. I don't. Because the hardest fight wasn't with him, it was with me, with the part of me that believed being the reasonable one meant absorbing more. I'm still calm, still analytical, still steady. But now, steadiness includes boundaries. And boundaries, when held without anger, create a different kind of presence. Not louder, just unmistakable. I am no longer the infrastructure holding someone else's comfort in place. I am the architect of my own. And that shift didn't require drama, just a decision. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a final twist, a moment where he realizes everything and makes a grand gesture, or where I reveal some hidden flaw that changes the entire narrative. There isn't one. There's just this. We argued about the same issue 38 times and never solved it once. Each fight ended with silence, not resolution. For a long time, I thought the absence of chaos meant the presence of health. I believed that if we weren't screaming, if we weren't threatening to leave, then we were stable. But stability without responsiveness is just stagnation with good lighting. What I learned is simple, but it took years to accept. If you have to repeatedly convince someone that your needs matter, the issue isn't your communication style, it's alignment. Quiet dominance isn't about punishing someone. It's not about revenge or proving a point. It's about refusing to argue for your own validity indefinitely. It's about recognizing when repetition becomes information. It's about understanding that silence can either shrink you or strengthen you. For me, strength looked like documentation instead of drama, planning instead of pleading, decisions instead of debates. I didn't leave in anger. I left in clarity. And clarity is a form of peace. If there's one takeaway from my story, it's this. The calmest person in the room is not always the most agreeable. Sometimes, she's the one who has already decided what she will and will not live with. So I'll leave you with this question. Have you ever stayed in a conversation long after you realized it wasn't going to change? just because it felt easier than making a decision. I'd really like to hear your experience in the comments.